The Clone Wars is some of my favourite Star Wars, and I wanted to capture the emotion I felt at the end. These are two dioramas based on the final scenes of the Clone Wars. The two living characters in them are Ahsoka Tano and Darth Vader. Whenever I've posted work in progress photos online, I always get a comment that says, but Darth Vader's lightsaber is red. Yes, this is actually Ahsoka Tano's lightsaber that he's picked up. So if you haven't seen it, that's why it's blue. So to pull it off, I needed Ahsoka Tano and Darth Vader. I found a Darth Vader file, links down below, from Galactic Armory, and I created Ahsoka in Blender, a free 3D modelling software. To get the sense of scale that I wanted, I printed them at about 3 inches high, works out at 1/24th scale on my Elegoo Mars. Then it was just a matter of clipping them all off their supports and tidying them up. I also needed about 40 clone trooper helmets, and I used a Galactic Armory Phase 2 file for those too. I just printed it out much smaller. Once everything was washed, printed and cured, I just had to tidy up any little nubs left over from the whole supports and any other issues. I like printing in clear resin, but it is hard to see, so I sprayed some grey primer and just carried on tidying them all up. Darth Vader needs his lightsaber, and thanks to Boylai Hobby Times, I knew all about these LEDs. They're Edison lamp replacement filaments, and they need 3 volts, and they're perfect. They come in multiple colours, and I picked blue to match the scene. I used magnet wire, which is copper wire covered in some kind of enamel coating. You scrape the ends off and then you can solder it. I cleaned up the LEDs, it's like a silicone outer, and then soldered them. I always checked several times that they carried on working. I did have quite a few resolders in this. It looks wonderful on video, but trust me, it took me quite a long time to get him in the right position with the wires bent, and then it totally soldered. Then I added a micro USB charging socket. It supplies 5 volts. So I added a 100 ohm resistor to avoid blowing the LED, and then just super glued it in place. Cue epic painting montage. Well, I like brush painting, so I started with a brush on Darth, but it really didn't work. So I went to an airbrush and used gloss black Tamiya. I had to paint his cloak and his sort of inner dress thing matte black, so I just used a Vallejo black for that. I touched up some of the gloss in the areas where the lightsaber stopped the airbrush working particularly well, and I made a satin by mixing gloss and matte. So far so good. I mean, he is just black after all. Then I painted his buttons white first so the colours popped. I mean, some of them are white anyway. His buckle and lightsaber got silver. He still has his lightsaber on because he's not holding his. It just got glued in place with a dab of super glue. Finally, I needed to hide the wire. I painted it white using paper to stop painting the actual LED. When it's on, it doesn't show, and when it's off, well, it just looks odd. I wish Ahsoka was as easy. It's not that she uses a lot of colours, orange, black, white, and a couple of blues, and I was done on the colour front, just a bit of mixing. Getting the orange for her face was okay. I did orange, spot of black, bit of white in there. No, my main problem was just getting her face to look realistic. Now, she is a cartoon character, so it's not like it needs to be that hard, but painting minuscule white little sort of face markings, eyes, leku, whatever it is, and then her clothing has a huge amount of detail, which thankfully is mostly hidden by the cloak. But all in all, it took me quite a while, and I must have redone the lips. I won't tell you how many times. I'm not totally happy with her face, but that's always the way with my figures. I'm never totally happy with their faces. And as I say, she is a cartoon character. So I just painted her. I painted a rough base coat, then I painted a sort of the surrounding, whatever colour that was. Then I did the base coat again, then I did the surrounding colours, and finished up with a wash on her cloak. If you thought that was it for the painting though, guess again. I 3D modelled some spikes in Blender. You'll see them in the base. The first set were a bit too flimsy. And I used the Galactic Armory Clone Trooper helmets. Then all I needed to do was paint everything. There's a mix of the orange-faced Ahsoka squad. It was like the 332nd Company, and they painted their faces in honour of her coming back to lead them. They were like family. She'd been with them since she was 14. This is probably the closest thing to her family. So when you see her standing in front of all those graves, you have to bear in mind, these people were all people to her. They weren't just clones, they were her family. And it makes it even more poignant when you think of it like that. So I painted quite a lot of the Stormtrooper helmets. I will admit I went through and marked up from the Clone Wars episode exact placement of all of them. So these are in exactly the right positions. Very sad. I even did Jesse's helmet. He was a lieutenant by the end. He was an ARC trooper, and made sure that that matched. I beat them all up a lot with black and other things because these guys have been in a crashed destroyer, so they did not come through this unscathed. They're all in graves, and it's just such a poignant moment, this, and I really wanted to make sure that these guys told the story that they needed to. They're such an integral part of the scene, and whilst we spend the time looking at Darth Vader with his trendy lightsaber and Ahsoka, these guys are the heroes of the Clone Wars, really. At least they are for me. The backdrop to these final scenes is a Venata-class destroyer, the Tribunal, that's crashed on this moon. I used screen grabs to design it in Blender. It's just a load of shapes on a background, and then I printed it out in filament. I ripped all the supports out, glued it all together. I've got to say, it wasn't perhaps the best join I've ever made in my life, so I had to fill it all with some acrylic putty. It's a background building and it's almost always out of focus, so I wasn't too fussed, and I'm going to put loads of junk in front of this as well. Modelling sci-fi junk is just so much fun. If you haven't done it, just go model something with bits. This is sheet styrene over a heat gun, twisted and held until it's cooled, and you can bash it around and get some really interesting deformed shapes. These are pipes. Jason Jensen mentioned these, and you just get them from a kid's play set. Straws, jumbo straws, cocktail straws, all this kind of stuff makes brilliant pipe work. You can cut it up, put it in place. And that's what I did. I just played. I bent loads and loads of pieces. I think this was a hose attachment. This was another shower hose, and another Jason Jensen special Hubba Bubba bobble tape. Cut them in half, snip the bottoms off, and they're like generator housings or something. I used magic hot glue to put everything in place, and the ones that had to stay vertical, I made sure I had everything upright when I put them in place, but everything else I just left flat. And when I was done, I took them outside and used black matte, just a car primer effectively, and sprayed it. My poor grass still has the stains. It was a bit dark though, so I sprayed it with some Tamiya fine grey surface primer. It's very cheap and cheerful, this. It's a background building. I don't want to spend too much time on it. I keep checking screenshots to make sure I'm doing it right. And this is a sort of red strip across the top where the hangar doors open. I didn't really want it to be too dark, so I really watered it down. And then I dabbed on some dark colours with a makeup sponge. I made sure I covered everything so it wasn't too even, and finally I added an isopropyl alcohol and dark black India ink wash. This is quite a dark one. I think it's 2 or 3 teaspoons of India ink per pint of alcohol. And I kept touching up that red because it still wasn't dark enough. Finally, I sealed it with Plasticoat Hobby and Craft, some matte sealant, so that I didn't end up with funny coloured snow. The bases. Starting off with Ahsoka's base, which is mostly browns. Actually, both bases have the same foam underpinnings. Expanded polystyrene. This was as large as I could get out the sheet, basically, and I rounded the corners off just because I felt they'd look good. And it's on a bit of firmer foam underneath. It wasn't quite large enough, so I glued on an extra bit of blue foam at the back before putting everything together. I did use a spot of white glue as well as hot glue, because by the time I've covered all this, the hot glue has set up at the beginning. And if I get it any hotter, it melts the polystyrene, so I can't use it. So I only put some dabs on to hold it while everything else dries. And then a huge amount of hot glue at the back to hold the back drop on to everything. Now I've covered it with my normal mix: white glue, tile grout and water. It works wonders on a base like this. You can butter it on. It was a little lumpy. I'm not that great at stirring, but I basically buttered the whole base with it, especially around the edges. I've gone for a floating feel. You can see here that there's a layer of foam underneath, so these don't sit on the base. They sort of float slightly in midair, which I felt was very Star Wars. Much like icing a cake, you can put your palette knife, this is, in water, and it will smooth it out quite nicely. I let it dry overnight and then I put a second layer on, and then I started to measure out the graves. I used Ahsoka to work out the lengths. I made the back row slightly shorter to almost like foreshorten it. And this can't be to scale because that ship is massive. And then I just spooned out loads and loads of graves. I've got 3 rows and I've actually got 11 graves wide. I used my palette knife in water again to just smooth out the edges and to add in some crash marks. Loads of stuff has flown off in front of the ship as it crashed into the moon. I sprayed everything with water as well, just to make sure that my palette knife didn't stick, because it was a bit of an issue. And then I smoothed it all out. Each one of those graves got rounded off so it was a nice heap rather than a sort of splodge. The next morning I added tile grout, it's taupe by Larson, and I used a sieve to add it in and then a brush to manipulate it. And this is just an easier layer to work with than the wet tile grout. I made sure each of my graves had a sort of heaped grave look. I don't know if there is such a thing. And I made sure they were nicely smoothed out. I added some crash patterns to the front. Finally, I used a big chip brush just to try and smooth out all of these areas so they didn't look like there were any brush marks, before spraying it with isopropyl alcohol and water, about 1/3 alcohol to 2/3 water. It helps set everything down and settle it. I will admit this is quite thick tar grout and I didn't add any sand, so there is a struggle to get the glue to sink in. So this alcohol layer is crucial. It's so crucial I dripped it on with a dripper bottle as well as using the spray. It just gives a better sort of density of liquid. And then I went over it with a glue. Now it's belt and braces because tar grout does include a glue. It's got a cement in it. But I used dilute matte Mod Podge. It's about 1/6 matte Mod Podge because that's what I can spray, and I just mix up huge amounts at a time. And I made sure that every area that I was doing had this isopropyl alcohol and water mix followed by an awful lot of glue. And I just want to make sure it's set, because otherwise when you come to do something later on, the top layer often detaches from the bottom because there's a dry bit in the middle that hasn't been glued. The next day, well, it's rock solid, but I feel it's a little bit rough, so I did it all again. And that was it. The base was done once it was dry. I should have used white tar grout straight away for this base. I eventually ended up using it because I tried foam putty. I've not used foam putty before, but I found I'd bought it twice, not just once, but twice for various projects. And I'd actually tried it for a project and it was horrendous and didn't work for what I needed it to. So I thought I'm going to use it up. Having found the second bottle, right, it's going. The first pot too dry, the second pot too wet. I just waited for it all to dry and started again with tar grout. I did this in exactly the same way as the Ahsoka base. I did add some white acrylic paint to the second coat of the tar grout because, well, it was just not quite white. I then decided time to add some icicles. I have these bush icicles. They're on a sort of sprue, so I super glued them in place, zapped them so they stayed, and there we go. Just adds a little bit extra, and you can see it in the Clone Wars. Time to add the snow. And it's just like the tar grout. Spray on a glue, sprinkle on a powder. This is Chrysel Snow by Precision Ice and Snow. I tried their glue, but it didn't go through my spray gun particularly well, and I diluted it a bit and then just went back to matte Mod Podge and isopropyl alcohol. So this is exactly like the tar grout, but this is a very, very nice snow product and produces a lovely fine end result. And now it's time to bring it all together. First up is Ahsoka, because she's standing in a specific position between two graves. One of them's got Jessie with the blue helmet. I I super glued her, zapped her in place, and then just filled around the feet with tile grout to make sure that she was bedded into the landscape, and then just used brushes to smooth it out. I mounted the spikes that I'd made. I painted them just like the backdrop with black spray paint, then grey spray paint. Then I drilled holes, shoved them in with a bit of white glue. I added some tile grout to all my helmets so that they matched. I think they'd have been polished so they wouldn't be too dirty. But, you know, there was a limit. There was a lot of graves to dig. And I just put them in place with a spot of glue. And that was it. Each of them, as I said before, placed in exactly the right position from all the panning shots in the show. So, yeah, I'm that sad. Really sad. And they don't all face forward. They do have slight angles on them. I added a slight dusting of... It was a slightly different colour tile grout, but it doesn't really show up. And then planted the 2 lightsabers that she's dropped, and there's a handout that she was holding it. Sprayed everything with isopropyl alcohol. I dripped it on the thicker areas around her feet to make sure that was nicely bedded in, and then measured where she was and transferred it over to the other base so I could drill a hole to get the wires through for Darth Vader's lightsaber. I very neatly cut out the base and then used copious amounts of hot glue to mount the micro USB and to hold the wires in place. There are 2 helmets visible, so I checked where they went and put them in place and just got them all lined up. I dug a little hole because they're slightly buried in the snow and I didn't want to do mounds of snow. And then I used AK Interactive Terrain Snow because I had the bottom of a pot to sort of fill out all the areas. There's a couple of lumpy bits from above and from some shots, and in other shots it's really smooth. So I was a little unsure what to do, but I went with a little bit of texture in the end so it wouldn't all look just like a bland white mass. I added matte Mod Podge around the edges and more Chrysel snow. I had to clean the helmets off, they all got covered, and then smooth the area around the outside with a brush. There's some clearly defined footprints leading up to Darth Vader. He didn't just beam in there. And I tried loads of high-tech solutions and ended up with the end of a brush just dabbing them down. More matte medium, more snow, and we were done. I kind of left that overnight to set up. The next morning, when everything was set so I wouldn't disturb it, I fed the wires through for Darth Vader and filled the hole with the terrain snow. More dilute matte Mod Podge, more Chrysel snow. You've guessed it, and then I was done. I love models that tell a story, and when I look at these 2 diorama, I'm transported back to those final scenes of the Clone Wars and all the emotion that comes alongside it. If you want something a little bit cheerier though and you like Star Wars, check out my Mandalorian Tatooine diorama. He's at least just looking after a kid, though it does have plenty of emotion by the end. Or perhaps Halo, the Master Chief zipping along to save the galaxy. I also have a starting scenery course that's aimed at just anybody who wants to get into scenery, and it starts with the basics. Otherwise, see you next time.